The term train as you play is pretty commonly thrown around these days, and for good reason. It's a pretty solid piece of advice. And in fact, it even has its own backing from within the field of psychology, because there is a term called heuristics. And what heuristics refers to is mental shortcuts that allows us to make quick and efficient decisions when faced with difficult and complicated problems. Now, this means that as humans, we don't need to expel large amounts of mental effort to be able to make very quick decisions, which are largely based on our previous experiences. An example of this is that if you've played a lot of cricket or baseball in your life and someone throws a ball at your head, then you're probably going to catch that ball before you even realise what you've done.
It's been keep it on the field.
Whereas, if you haven't played a lot of sports in your life and someone throws a ball at your head, well... Now, these heuristics aren't just restricted to physical tasks either, because here we have Magnus Carlsen, arguably the best chess player that has ever lived, talking about how he approaches the game.
When you play chess professionally at a high level, your brain is really trained to narrow the search and to use intuition because you know there is a limited amount of time. So you're trained to recognize patterns and sort of make these quick decisions.
And so this just clearly demonstrates just how these mental shortcuts or mental slides based on our previous experiences can help us navigate through our daily life. Now, this will clearly relate back to the fireground, but if I were to stick with the sporting analogy for just a little while longer, a few years ago I joined up with a soccer club, or football if you happen to live in one of the countries that calls it football. Now, this was absolutely a social league where there wasn't high expectations for performance. It was just about having some fun and keeping fit. But to play the game on Sunday, you had to turn up to training during the week. And so each training session during the week would involve fitness drills, fundamental skills like kicking and passing and all those sorts of things. And it would even involve mock games against the other half of the team or other teams within the club to simulate as real-world environments as possible. And the reason why we would do this is so that we could create those mental shortcuts for the skills that we would need to play the game. It meant that when we were actually playing a game against an opponent, we wouldn't need to think about how to react when they went one way or the other. We would just simply be able to react in an instant without needing to expel too much mental effort. And so this just clearly demonstrates the benefits of this kind of thinking. And it shows that whenever we're training, it's vital that we make that training as realistic to the real world use of that skill as possible, so that when we are actually faced with the situation of needing to know what to do, our mental shortcuts will reflect what we're being asked to do. Now, it's really interesting to think that the team would train at least once a week for a game that was largely social in nature. And yet, when we relate this back to the fireground, I bet that if I asked most firefighters out there how often they go out and perform high-quality live fire training, it wouldn't be once a week. It might be every few months. It may even be every few years, or it could be longer than that again. Now, I'm not having a go at fire departments when I say this, because with high quality live fire training, there comes a whole series of logistical issues, there comes staffing issues, access to instructors, there's issues around the cost of the training and a whole heap of other things. So it's not as easy to just go out and run these kinds of training sessions. But it is an interesting thought when you think about how often we might train for just a social game of soccer versus how often we would train for the actual fireground. Because when we think about a game of soccer, well, there are a lot of knowns before we walk onto the pitch. We know that the pitch itself is going to be a well-manicured space with defined lines showing us where we can and can't go. We know the ball is going to be a regulation size. There's going to be a referee determining what we can and can't do, and a whole heap of other things that we're going to know before we walk onto that pitch. Whereas when it comes to the fireground, I'd argue that there are a lot more unknowns than there are knowns, because as we arrive at a fire, we don't know the overall fuel load of that fire. We don't know how or when that fire was started. We don't know if there are people inside that need rescuing or not. We only know some very brief bits of information as we arrive and begin to do our size up. And so when we're making decisions on the fireground, we're not making them from a point where we have a lot of information about that incident. And we're also making these decisions very quickly, which means we don't have time to stop and think deeply about what is actually occurring and what is our best course of action. So this means that when we're making decisions on the fireground, we're going to be making them using heuristics, using these mental shortcuts that rely heavily on our previous experiences. And yes, the previous incidents that we've gone to will aid in this response, but those incidents aren't very good opportunities to train because the stakes are much higher than they are on the training ground. And so when we're talking about live fire training, it's important that that training is at a high quality and is as realistic as we can manage, so that those mental shortcuts, those heuristics, line up with what we're going to see on the fireground. And this is the final point I wanted to bring up today, because when we think about the fuels that we are burning in our live fire burns, because generally we're going to be burning some kind of wood or timber conglomerate material like chipboard or pallets or some other kind of naturally based material. Now, this means that the fuels that we are burning, for instance wood, is going to be around about 50% carbon and have a relatively high thermal inertia in comparison to the modern synthetic materials that we actually see on the fireground, like polyurethane foam, which has a carbon content of almost 90% and a very low thermal inertia, which means that in comparison to timber, the modern synthetic materials will break down very quickly, they will begin to pyrolyze very quickly, and they have very high fuel loads within them. Now, what this means for our live fire burns is that we're replicating fires that are burning in largely natural materials rather than modern synthetic materials. And as was demonstrated by UL, fires burning in natural materials burn significantly different to fires burning in modern synthetic materials. And so there's a pretty solid argument to be made that we're preparing ourselves for a fireground that doesn't really exist anymore. Now, I'm not saying that we should go out and fill our burn cells with couches and mattresses and these sorts of things, because by using natural materials like wood, we can get longer burn times, we can get slower developing fires, and we can actually control the conditions so that we can ensure that we warm to inform rather than burn to learn, because we want to create an environment where the firefighters have an opportunity to take in the conditions and have a look at how things are evolving and the effect that their firefighting tactics are having on that fire. Whereas if we were to fill our burn cells with modern synthetic materials, we would get much faster fire development, it would reach ventilation control at a much faster rate, the overall heat release rate would arguably be much higher, and we would have a much smaller opportunity to actually provide good learning conditions for the participants. And so when we're talking about live fire burning, I genuinely do believe that the timber we're using does provide a really good learning environment. But when we're talking about the heuristics, those mental shortcuts we're talking about, when we're looking at the modern synthetic materials, there are some shortcomings by using the natural materials. And so I think there's a really solid argument that whenever we're creating a training package, it is really important that fires burning in modern synthetic materials are represented in some way. Whether this be a flashover cell where we can watch genuine couches and mattresses and these sorts of things pass through to flashover while being in the safer position of being outside of the burn cell in fresh air. Or If that's not possible due to environmental, financial, or other logistical issues, it's important that those training packages are backed up by good quality videos showing fires moving through to flashover and ventilation-induced flashover, so that your participants can gain those mental slides, create those mental shortcuts that actually represent the modern fireground that we fight fires on today. Alright, so hopefully through all of this, I've been able to demonstrate just how important our previous experiences are in helping us to develop these mental shortcuts or heuristics so that we can manage complex and timely decisions in the moment that we need to. And this should also just show how important it is that for as much as possible that we train as we play, in regardless of what it is we're doing, whether it be first aid training or driving training or pumping training, or even with urban fires, because the more we can include a realistic component to the overall training package, the more that we can ensure that we can gain those mental slides that will aid us to make more accurate and more timely decisions in the moment that we need to. Alright, well, that's it for this one. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.